Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, April 19th, 2021, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. We have a great one for you this week, but before we dive in, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible each and every week. Remember, Talk Nerdyism will always be 100% free to download, and that's because of the support from listeners just like you. You can pledge your support in a bunch of different ways that you can learn by visiting talknerdy.com. Chief among them is by going to patreon.com/talknerdy and pledging your support per episode. This week's top patrons include Mary Neva, Michael Gaucher, Brian Holden, Christopher Pitts, Daniel Lang, David J. E. Smith, Dudas Infinitus, June Sapara, Leonard Prince, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, Elise Christie, and Robert Christ. Thank you all so much. All right, let's talk about this week's episode. I had the incredible opportunity to sit down with the author of Fundamentals, 10 Keys to Reality. He is Dr. Frank Wilczek. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2004. He was also an early MacArthur Fellow. He's written several books, hundreds of articles. He has a regular column in the Wall Street Journal called Wilczek's Universe, and he is a professor of physics at MIT, a founding director of the T.D. Lee Institute and chief scientist at the Wilczek Quantum Center in Shanghai, and a distinguished professor at Arizona State University and Stockholm University. Not at all busy. Not at all. Again, his book is Fundamentals, 10 Keys to Reality. Here he is, Nobel laureate, Dr. Frank Wilczek. Well, Frank, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
So we're going to be talking about your newest book, Fundamentals, 10 Keys to Reality. But before we dive into your book, I think it's going to be incredibly important for everybody listening to learn a little bit about your background and to, hear about the work that led to your Nobel Prize in physics, to hear about some of the important kind of fellowships that you've worked under and the awards that you've gotten for your work, but even more than that, what it is that you did within the physics community, because as I've been trying to dive deep into it, I feel like this is, for me, a bit wonky. I'm not sure I follow.
All right. It's not as bad as it looks. So, in the spirit of your question, I'll primarily talk about my work in theoretical physics, but then I'll mention some of my broader interests. So we can start with the Nobel Prize work, which was actually grew out of the very first work I did.
In graduate school, right?
As a graduate student, that's right. There are four basic forces of nature. There's gravity and electromagnetism, which most educated people know about.
Yeah, and we've covered them on the show a lot.
I've had beautiful theories and successful theories that tell you a lot. In the case of gravity, since the 17th century with Newton, and then with a major upgrade by Einstein in the general theory of relativity in the beginning of the 20th century, and then in electromagnetism with mature, beautiful equations in the middle of the 19th century from Maxwell, and then important updates with the introduction of quantum mechanics in the early 20th century. But then when people got the ability to explore inside atoms, they found that those two forces were inadequate, that there had to be two additional forces. And those are called, maybe not very imaginatively, those are called the strong and the weak force. And the weak force we can put aside for the moment. It's complicated. It has to do with how particles can change their identity, and they're important in understanding radioactivity and how stars develop their energy, and some important things about the universe. But the strong force is the one that's relevant to me and at the moment, and it's the strongest force in nature. And it's the force that holds atomic nuclei together. And ultimately, it goes even one level deeper. It's the force that constructs the things that make atomic nuclei, protons and neutrons, out of more fundamental objects, the quarks and the gluons. So what I did was basically leveraging a lot of information that experimentalists had uncovered and principles of relativity and quantum mechanics that had been developed in the first 2/3, roughly, of the 20th century. I figured out what the equations of the strong force are, and how to tell that. So at first, of course, they were candidate equations. They were inferred from various indirect clues, to validate the theory, we had to have new tests. We introduced a very specific picture of what gluons are. That was new, and so we had new equations and ways of testing them, and it worked. To make a long story short, and it opened up a lot of doors in understanding the physical world, and opened up, for instance, our ability to understand the early moments of the Big Bang, which was previously impossible.
Can I ask an interjecting question? And it might be kind of a naive question, but when we think about these kind of like subatomic particles, and we think about what we know now about how they come together, the strong force being involved, how they organize, and we talk about the difference between sort of the theoretical physics, the equations, the mathematics of the universe, and then the experimental physicists, I think about smashing atoms. I think about colliders. But what I don't think about is direct observations of an intact nuclei and the forces involved in that. Is that something we can observe?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
But that's doing it the hard way, though. It turns out that's what people tried to do in the early days of nuclear physics, and around the turn of the century, the previous century. And when you tried to study the strong interaction that way, it looked very, very complicated. And that's why people, and now in retrospect, we know it's because protons and neutrons actually are complicated objects. They're made out of simpler objects, and although the protons and neutrons don't obey simple equations, the subparticles do, the quarks and gluons. The equations that I discovered.
Right, but we didn't know that back then.
Didn't know it back then, and it emerged from experiments at accelerators and things like that. When you bash protons together, you can sort of, if you do it artfully, actually, if you scatter electrons off protons, it turns out, then you can sort of take snapshots of what's inside protons, and that revealed that there are quarks, and then with a little fancier inference that they were gluons and what their properties are, and that's what we figured out. But it was, I want to emphasize that this was not a result of introspection or gazing at my navel or anything. It was very much based on experimental clues, and the clues were it needed a lot of inference and calculation to figure out what the clues meant. That's why it was worth a Nobel Prize. But then to work out tests and applications of it that really validated the picture in detail.
Right. So it becomes this kind of iterative loop. The observations beget the mathematics, beget more observations, and
just to round out this picture, because I don't want to get too technical, but it turns out that the theory predicts that the strong interactions become much simpler to understand, much weaker when you go to high energies. So we were able to make very definite predictions about what would happen at higher energy machines than it existed at the time. And that's both useful in understanding what's happening at these higher energy machines, but also gives tests of the theory. Although the initial clues and inferences were very intricate and indirect, at high energy accelerators, you can pretty much see the quarks and gluons. Any fool could have figured it out at that point, right? So,
but how incredible to, you were doing this work in graduate school. You're still a young man, but you have put decades of your life into this work. And so to be able to see evidence and to see it crystallize in newer and more interesting ways with each new technological development within the field.
yes.
How has that been for you?
Well, it's been a transcendent experience. Early in my career, I think the closest I've actually had to a kind of spiritual experience in connection with my work, or really of any kind since my teenage years, was when I had done some of these basic calculations, but the theory was still somewhat speculative in its applications to nature. I visited Brookhaven National Laboratory and sort of saw the kind of apparatus and instruments that would be used to test this theory. And I was just flabbergasted to think that I had, with pencil and paper, just done these calculations that seemed to inhabit an entirely different universe, a kind of conceptual universe. And yet it was this, these wires and magnets and things that you would put together. And there's somehow a correspondence between the ideal and the real. That's not vague. That's not, metaphysical speculation. It's very real, and it could have been wrong. but the idea that there is this kind of harmony between idea and reality, just it came upon me like a mystical experience. That was
Yeah, I mean,
now,
the profundity of
that was
that.
over very quickly,
And then it was back to work.
but then the fact that it got validated, by a slow process of accumulating data over decades, and it's really flourished into a very powerful tool for understanding the basic operations of reality. It's just been a transcendental experience. Students today just take it as established. These equations are correct. Okay, so now you wouldn't. It wasn't always that way. And I remember, and to experience the transition between kind of vague speculative ideas and to calculations, to making them precise, and then to seeing them be tested, it's just been an extraordinary journey. I feel very blessed to have to have lived through that. In fact, more than once. I've just had, because I've had other theories that are maybe not quite as important, but maybe in the future, maybe they may turn out to be that have also just, in fact, fairly recently gotten decisive experimental.
And are those in the same general area of inquiry?
No, they're quite different.
Okay.
Well, they're physics, but
right, but that's everything. So
this is something called anyons, which are not basic building blocks of nature automatically in the usual sense. They are a kind of emergent particle that exists in special states of matter that have very unusual properties. They have a kind of memory. And I kind of predicted this behavior and how roughly indicated how it could be observed experimentally.
So these were theoretical particles.
They were through theoretical constructions, yes. And again, inferences and kind of a little bit of wishful thinking, a little bit of conceptualization goes into the... but that was in the early 80s. And people have been trying to observe them ever since. A lot of people worked hard, and they learned a lot of things that could go wrong. And I was originally I thought it would be a matter of a few months before this happened, but it was really only in the last year decisive experiments have been done, and there are serious ideas that these kinds of particles could be the basis of new ways of computing, so-called topological quantum computing, which could be very, very powerful.
Right. So there's not just a fundamental expansion of knowledge that comes from this, but a potential application that could be gained.
This one is, well, as applications of advanced theoretical physics go, this one is incredibly down to earth by my
Well, and it speaks to that iterative process, right? Because I was going to ask, is the reason that the observations have only just come to light within the past year because we simply didn't have the resolving power, we simply didn't have the tools, or was it a function of it took that long until we were creative enough to do it?
Well, both. I mean,
Right.
development of the appropriate tools is a creative endeavor.
But sometimes we're just bottlenecked. We're bottlenecked by computing power, or we're bottlenecked by
there were bottlenecks
observation
here.
power.
The bottlenecks here had to do with purification of materials, with sensitivity of detectors, and technical things that would take a little bit of explaining, but basically sufficient isolation of the systems that you could see this behavior in the presence of other confounding influences. And people, learn the hard way how to do all these things by repeated attempts and failures. But now that the secret sauce is known, I think progress could be quite rapid.
And it's so important to document and to discuss these failures, to learn from these failures, because that's how we eventually kind of, this might be an oversimplification, but we can find the signal in the noise. And that's really oftentimes what we're looking to do.
Exactly, right.
It's incredible, and it speaks to something that came up for me as we were kind of on this journey together, is that you were discussing this idea that there are once something that was theoretical becomes validated to the extent that it kind of becomes somewhat more paradigmatic or entrenched as theory, right?
I think I told this story in Fundamentals, actually, but it's a story that really has stuck in my mind, and it's when I was early in my career, I was a professor at Princeton, and the chairman was Val Fitch, who was a great experimental physicist who discovered a phenomenon that won him the Nobel Prize. That was the fact that the physical laws, if you run them backwards in time, don't look the same as when you run them forwards in time. So it's
like an entropy discovery.
But it's not statistical mechanics. This has to do with the most basic equations. I mean, people knew about, of course, the second law of thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, but for a long time, all the fundamental equations of physics were thought to look the same if you ran them backwards in time. And he discovered, in a rather obscure corner of particle physics having to do with decays of K-mesons, which are highly unstable particles that are only produced at accelerators. Anyway, there's this small, tiny thing which indicated that it was not a general law of nature, that the laws don't look the same forwards and backwards in time. And this was, epical discovery, really, and years later looks more important than ever. Anyway, I had worked out some applications of this in cosmology to the early universe to maybe help explain why there's more matter than antimatter in the universe. Built on it in other ways to motivate a particle called axions, which it turns out might be the dark matter of the universe. That's still unsettled, but looks very promising.
Solid candidate.
I was telling him about all this, and then I realized, and he looked very wistful as I was doing this, and it took me a moment to realize why. It's because I was discussing his discovery, this fact about the world, as if it were historical fact, not a recent discovery that this very person had done. and so I kind of looked at him quizzically, and he said, "Yes, yesterday's sensation is today's calibration." And he was a wonderful person, very, very kind, gentle person, and that really stuck with him. And that's really the ultimate validation of a theory or an experimental discovery, is that people use it as a tool to take further steps, right? And I saw that happen with with quantum chromodynamics, this strong interaction theory that we've been discussing. In the beginning, it was a theoretical proposal, and at big international conferences on particle physics, there would be sessions about tests of QCD. It was very exciting. People were doing experiments to see if the equations actually worked, if the predictions were right. And it was, these were the highlights of the big international conferences for several years. But gradually, those same, as the tests came in, and it worked, instead of being the headline sessions, they became applications of QCD. It was no longer something you tested; it was something you used. And even
Right.
though the calculations and the use of it were much more difficult and rich than the clues we used and the initial validating observations. So in a sense, it was a much better theory that people could do more with it. The calculations were more accurate and the experiments were more accurate and so forth. It became much less exciting. so I say now, yesterday's sensation is today's calibration and tomorrow's background. So now it's called calculating backgrounds, the same kind of thing, because people take it for granted and want to see other new things that this can't account for.
And there are so many examples of that even in our daily lives, of getting kind of accommodating to technological advancements and like very quickly becoming frustrated by them, or and not appreciating the phenomenal nature.
I'm old enough to remember when seeing someone as you talk to them was a dream.
Oh, it was Bradbury sci-fi,
right?
Yeah,
and I'm even old enough to remember when I was in Italy and wanted to call the United States, and that was you had to reserve a place, and it was very expensive, and so even international telephone calls were very elaborate, and now we we do video calls that are routinely, and have Zoom meetings with many people and all kinds. And in the future, of course, we'll have virtual presence, telepresence, and be able from a distance not only to interact sort of at the level of information, but actually pick things up. And it's kind of, so these things, it's that's the thing about science and technology. It builds.
and I think the funny thing is that there's a conception in our minds about the difference, the mismatch. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. The mismatch between the evolution, the explosive kind of Moore's law type of evolution of computing power, and of let's say advancements in physics and chemistry, and the evolution of ideas and the concept of ideas within society. And the strange thing is, when we then overlay human beings into the conversation, that these things occur because people do them, and things happen on a generational scale with people. You go back to Kuhn, and you talk about scientific revolution. And I was reflecting the other day on the fact that, like, Camus, so I'm going to philosophy now because this is my sort of world right now. Camus died in the 60s. Heidegger died in the 70s. Sartre died in the 80s, 1980s. And people think of them as being like Aristotle. They're from a completely different era.
Or Bertrand Russell, who's meant a lot to me. I forget exactly when he died, but I know he protested against the Vietnam War, so it was certainly after that, right?
Right. And it's so interesting how we often do have a psychological mismatch between the evolution of thought, the evolution of how we know what we know, the epistemology, and the actual technological advancements, the actual discoveries that take place. How recent in history so many things happened, and yet so quickly that becomes the background.
Yeah, or the pace of discovery, because of improvements in communication, and also just because there are more people involved, and also because science builds, and that is I don't know how to make this precise, but certainly one has the sense that strong, convincing sense that the pace of discovery is increasing, and and I think there's an interesting parallel with biological evolution here on Earth. So the simplest forms of what you might call life emerged about 4 billion years ago, basically as soon as the Earth cooled off enough that things just didn't boil away. And for the first 3.5 billion years or so, it was still very primitive, or on the surface, it was still single-celled organisms, but they were building up this infrastructure of metabolism and heredity and so forth. And that was very slow. But once you had that platform, it was then the innovations that led to multicellular life, and then to you and me, were relatively easy.
And an eye blink in
right.
You're right. This and it makes me wonder, what do you say then to people? Because I sometimes get frustrated with this as a science communicator, when people are, the phrase like being so open-minded that your brains fall out. Like when people who tend to fall victim to pseudoscience and fall victim to non-science will say things like, think about, 500 years ago, we knew nothing about X. And so what are we going to now know 500 years from now? Which I think is an important sentiment, and there is truth to that. But what we know now is profound and not likely to dramatically shift the same way.
Yeah, there's a core of things that we know, and
right.
The proof is in the pudding. Here I am talking to you across the country. That you can't fake that. And
there's a mentality that we're going to radically shift again in such a profound way that, like, the fundamentals of nature will be turned on their ear once more.
Well, there may be profound changes in conceptualization. I guess a model for this is the general theory of relativity, which was a new theory of gravity. Newton's theory of gravity was incredibly successful for many years, of course, and supported a tremendous variety of applications, and it's kind of as validated as a scientific theory can get.
Didn't we call lots of these things laws?
We call them laws.
Yeah.
And yet the conceptual foundations of Einstein's theory, general relativity, are quite different, and really, but
they build.
Having said, they definitely build. They would have been, as a practical matter, impossible to discover without Newton's theory to build on. But moreover, we still use Newton's theory. We don't
exactly. They don't replace. They build.
When we don't, it's much easier to use, and almost always works if you take into account that it breaks down around black holes or in the very early universe or super large things or so. But if we want to plan space voyages, if we want to do any kinds of geology or practical or planetary astronomy, so many practical applications, we use Newton's theory with confidence because it works. It works. So it's not so there can be tremendous changes in conceptualization, but they won't. I think that's possible. It's hard to know, but they won't change the applications. We know the QCD is not going to go away. Newton's laws of gravity are not going to go away because they're based on facts and explain an enormous amount of hard data. So it's not a matter of opinion. It's not. We really do know a lot, and
we do.
Also part of knowing a lot is understanding that there are also things we don't know, but there's a lot we do know. And okay, so yeah.
It's the humility. The humility is important, but again, it's like kind of the neuroscientific equivalent that comes to my mind is that, sure, we do not fully understand this holy grail of how mind emerges from brain. Consciousness is still a bit of a black box for us. That said, if we learn more about it, it will not nullify the fact that neurons operate chemically and physically. It will not nullify an action potential. Those things will continue to be true. We're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater and completely change our mind. Whereas in the past, we thought that people caught, what was it, like bad air? There was miasma, and there were, we didn't have the fundamental knowledge.
And that they had souls, and that there were little homunculi that were the basis of heredity. There, these little people within people and stuff.
Right. And that we could change. We now know the fundamentals.
That's right. That's exactly what I tried to get across for our understanding of the most fundamental laws as they appear today, is that they explain an awful lot, and their domain of application really includes all forms of engineering that's likely to be practical and plus chemistry and biology in the foreseeable future. Now, they don't tell us all the secrets of the universe. They don't tell us what happened before the Big Bang, or even if that question makes sense. They don't tell us what the dark matter is. There are still mysteries, but they tell us an awful lot, and they enable us to do technological wonders, and they also allow us to formulate and hope to address deeper mysteries than ever before. We really do have a chance of understanding the very earliest moments of the Big Bang. We really do have, I think, a very good chance of discovering what the dark matter is. So these are pretty good, and I think we have a good chance. Also, I think we'll also make big steps towards understanding how mind emerges from matter, and that'll be partly because we have now minds that for sure emerge from matter. One is sitting in my lap right now. we have models where things that we make, the machines that people built, based on designed and constructed based on what we think are the laws of physics, and they actually work, and they do things that would have been considered as mind, like play chess very well and play games, and now design proteins and all kinds of things that would have been thought of as very high levels of intelligence. I don't see any sign that that's not going to continue and deepen. I think it's a great problem to me that actually I'm starting to think about is the missing ingredient is self-awareness.
Right.
But
Right. That there's
self-awareness is something that, it's in simple forms. We certainly know how to program. We can have a part of the computer that looks at the rest of the computer and monitors its state and maybe plays. And so I don't think that's. I think talking about consciousness is sort of biting off more than you can chew and is vague. But if you talk about self-awareness and understanding it better and better, I think I think it's a scientific problem on which you can make progress and will. Right.
I'm interested in your take on the concept of a gestalt, of a whole, a functional unit, whether it be the human mind or whether it be, something larger, the elegance of the cosmos being greater than the sum of its parts. And impossibility, or is it a possibility to calculate the gestalt?
Oh, it's routine. I mean, if you interpret it broadly enough, uh, I talked about quarks and gluons versus protons. So at a fundamental level, we have quarks and gluons and on these nice equations. But then for many practical purposes, similarly to the way we use Newton's laws instead of Einstein's gravity, because they're easier to work with. In many circumstances, it's easier just to forget about the quarks and gluons and work with protons. And then in chemistry, you don't even work with protons and neutrons; you work with atomic nuclei. Uh, so there are different levels of encapsulation. You can hide the details and work very, very well if you have the right concepts to work to go to the next level. And then you can just in the book, in fact, I discuss a rather mundane example. You feel like it's not cosmic, but say someone who wants to be a balloonist, to ride a balloon. That person doesn't want to hear about atoms and molecules and the fundamental interactions. They want to know about sort of emergent laws that have to do with things like pressure and temperature and volume. And so there are different levels of description that are useful in different contexts, and discovering that there's something called pressure that's useful, there's something temperature that's useful. It's a great discovery, and that the laws that are involved are very well stated and useful and so forth. So there are models within physics on a relatively modest scale. Then, but if you're talking about human beings and trying to predict their behavior, knowing the fundamental laws of physics are not really much help at
Yeah,
all,
it's
right?
interesting. So it's
Unless you're
really
talking about very specific things like how they will behave in the presence of a nuclear explosion, or something.
like what will
If you're
actually
trying
happen
to
to their bodies.
predict how they'll behave in a social situation, it's entire those concepts are entirely inappropriate and basically useless. But concepts like personality, concepts like, well, the things you study in psychology, different, more fine-grained descriptions of
Right.
personality.
Kind of psychometric
And
approaches.
yeah, that these. So that's I think an example of what you're alluding to. Uh, the whole can be different from and uh, more than, in a sense, the sum of its parts, because to make an adequate description of the behavior of big things, you may need to use entirely different concepts than you use to describe the fundamentals, if you like, even though those big things are made out of the fundamental objects. And we think that ultimately, yes, you can analyze a lot of how they work step by step down. You can sort of nominally work down, but in practice, you can't. The calculations are much too complicated. The knowledge of the state you'd need to have is totally unrealistic. And in fact, not only practically, but even in principle, you can't know the state. So So yes, I mean, so there are different levels of description that are necessary, useful, and there's no reason to apologize for being a chemist or being a psychologist or something. I don't share this kind of snobism of theories of everything means in practice theories of fundamental physics. No, a theory of fundamental physics would not be a theory of everything.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating concept, this idea of prediction, of modeling and prediction, and at what level of analysis are these things meaningful, right? And at what level of analysis do these things translate into an approximation of reality? Um, and you're right. There are still some major unknowns that maybe hopefully are knowable. Hopefully,
Yeah, I think so. Well, I think we can make progress on them. It's difficult to tell in advance what the nature of the conceptual understanding that ultimately proves most fruitful or fruitful for a few centuries will be, but I am very optimistic that we'll understand minds much better, and for instance, and hopefully understand how to make social arrangements that make people happy and uh, and thrive better. Um,
and to do it
yeah,
hopefully in a humanistic and non-reductionistic way, because we've been burned,
yeah,
right?
no,
We know
that's
what
right. Yeah,
happens when
well, it's very dangerous.
psychometrics. Yeah.
It's very dangerous to use inappropriate concepts because you've got physics envy or anything. No, no,
Well, that's how eugenics started. That is what these kind of processes in
yeah,
psychology, these intelligence testing processes, that's what they're founded on.
yeah,
And
and
that is, you're
physics
right.
envy, physics envy. Yes,
It's physics and yeah, that's a great way to put
that's
it.
the and physics is great, but it's not. It could be inappropriate to try to mimic it too literally. The and and I talk in fundamentals. In fact, I have the final chapter, which I think in a way is the most fundamental and profound principle is complementarity, which is precisely this, that there can be different ways of thinking about the same entity that answer different questions and use concepts that are incommensurate, that you really can't express in any useful way, one in terms of the other. So, so if you try to explain, uh, how should I say kindness or empathy in terms of quarks and gluons, you're really misguided. it's not.
Right. Sometimes even doing it in terms of neural activity is misguided. We're still not there yet,
Yeah.
Um,
The and I think a lot of fruitless discussions about, say, free will versus determinism are based on this kind of confusion that that you should use the same language or the same concepts to answer all questions. It's just not right. There are different kinds of language and different kinds of concepts that are appropriate to answering different kinds of questions. And sort of polluting one domain with the other can impede understanding rather than aiding it.
well, and what an important, profound, and in many ways humble revelation, especially for individuals who dedicate their lives within the sciences, who maybe take more of a logical, positivistic, philosophical stance, right? Who are a little more interested in a material world, maybe who, like myself, are atheist, who don't lend themselves readily to a lot of metaphysical explanation. Yet at the same time, this humility to be able to say, that there are multiple levels of analysis, there are different languages for interpretation, and the more that we try to force this idea that unless I can explain it with a randomized controlled trial, and unless, then it's not valid. I mean, that I think becomes problematic. I see it a lot within the skeptic community. People who love and trust science so much, as I do, but they almost make it a stand-in for everything in the universe.
Well, yes. I mean, there's an enormously rich culture that's developed over many centuries, that has been inseminated or fertilized by many great thinkers around the different religious traditions, and a lot of life experience in what kind of behavior works out and what doesn't, and what makes cohesive communities, and what makes people happy. And you can learn from it. You can learn from it, and you should. and and just having a kind of mindless hostility because there are mistakes that you can identify. And well, yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, you shouldn't swallow it whole and uncritically, but you can learn from it, and yeah, it has value. And you can try to put yourself in the other guy's shoes, and if nothing else, it helps you understand people. If it's mind expanding, I think mind expanding, to me, mind expansion is always good. So, being able to use and exercise your imagination to see the world in different ways, even if you think that ultimately they're misguided, stretching your mind that way, using your imagination, I think is a very good thing.
Frank, there's one more kind of big conceptual thing that I want to dive into you before we sort of do the tail end work that I like to do on my show. As I'm looking through fundamentals, obviously it's organized in a brilliant way. Let's understand space. Let's understand time. Let's talk about the subatomic, the actual fundamental nature of the universe. And we could have spent time today getting a lesson in that. I feel like that's why people read the book, and that's not what I want to spend time focusing on. But what I am fundamentally interested in here, no pun intended, is why you were compelled to do this encapsulation. And just for a little bit of context, I recently had two very deep interviews. One with a guest on the show named Dave Farina, who talked all about, he wrote a book called Is This Wi-Fi Organic? And it's all about, if we know more about the fundamentals, we will be better critical thinkers. We will be able to have a better baloney detection kit, all that good stuff, kind of the skeptic's toolbox. And then on the flip side of that, I recently did a deep conversation I hosted for a different event with Brian Greene, the theoretical physicist, and we talked quite a bit about, does grandma need to know about X, or do I, as a human being who exists in this other plane, how much do I need to know to be able to have that psychological robustness and that curiosity and that ability to make sense of the world around me. So from a science communication, kind of science literacy perspective, I'm interested in your motivation for the book and where you feel like humanity would benefit from this kind of knowledge.
Yes, well, I had very much exactly this kind of question in mind when I settled down to write it. The immediate provocation was conversations that I've had from time to time with many of my friends who are not practicing scientists, but lawyers or business people, or media people, or just different kinds of people. Some of them are students. That they ask me what I do, and you know, I can tell them a little bit, and then they fall asleep or whatever.
Shut down the plane conversation.
They sort of politely nod, but I can see their eyes glazing over. But they're really curious. They want to know, and also they're bombarded by announcements of revolutionary this and breakthrough that and so forth, and and they know it's mostly bullshit. They want to know, but they want to know what's really going on.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to answer those questions of theirs. And as I wrote it, I also realized that I was writing it for myself as a teenager when I had those kinds of questions. And that's why I went into the business, so to speak, the kind of philosophical and even theological questions about. So I wanted to supply for those people who are curious and very intelligent but don't have knowledge what I thought was that they would benefit from, that would expand their minds, that wouldn't, but wouldn't burden them with the details they don't need, or things that are too speculative, or I wanted to be straight, give them a clear picture of what I think I've learned most fundamentally about how the physical world works, that's relevant to thinking about fundamental questions of existence, what it all means, and how it makes sense, and putting new discoveries in the right framework, and looking forward to the future, while keeping the book reasonably thin. so I wanted to be
so it's digestible.
So it's digestible, exactly.
Yeah, and has a prose that speaks to people at a fundamental level. Tells a story, has a beauty in the language, so it's not esoteric. It's I know
That's
we're
what
running.
I tried to do. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it brings up something for me that's, I don't know why this comes up for me. This is kind of a personal thing, but I remember talking to a dear friend of mine and watching how they studied, how they read, and comparing it to how I study and how I read. And this person pores over their book and makes a million notes and flags, but for every single thing they read. And for me, I just read it. And sure, if it's a foundational piece of literature that I need, a philosopher that's important for my work, or a book to help me guide my dissertation, of course I'm marking it up. But for the most part, I just read it, and then I read the next one, and then I read the next one. And it's kind of two takes of like, can I squeeze the life out of this information, or will I just get it the more I absorb and the longer I'm exposed? And I love to take that approach, that maybe people aren't going to understand every word. They're not going to remember everything you said, but being exposed to these ideas over and over and over, and in different languages, and with different twists, they become imbued in us.
I hope so. And my style is much closer to yours, probably. I even when I'm reading advanced physics or mathematics books, I always first give them the once over.
Right.
So
What's
I
the
sort of
gist?
so I know where it's heading. And that's really important as motivation, because you have to do a hard work to really understand it logically. And so it's both motivational, but also important, because the ultimate goal is to understand the whole thing. and and it's not, you don't, it's very hard to get there sort of logically, step by step, or to put it more eloquently and more briefly and more memorably, maybe, you don't have to understand everything before you understand anything.
Right. The hope is
To
that you
me,
get it.
you
It's
get
not
it
that you
at some
know
point.
every small detail, but that you get it.
Yeah, that's right. You see how it fits together,
Yeah.
and
And you
then
can
you can,
connect it to other things in your mind.
exactly, and then you can fill in details as necessary, as you find it entertaining. Which
Ah, well,
it
Frank,
is, physics can be very entertaining if you go into it very deeply, but it's also entertaining if you don't go. It's entertaining at all levels,
yeah.
and in particular, but I think the most essential things that will enable you to appreciate how much we've understood, but also its limitations, and how it informs questions that were traditionally thought of as philosophical or theological. That's what I tried to to boil down in fundamentals.
Yeah, distilled down to only 228 pages, which is, I mean, people can't see this, so I don't know why I'm showing the width of the book, but it's definitely,
and it's not small print.
No, this is
full of
doable.
equations.
It's not. I haven't seen an equation yet, actually.
Well, there are a couple, but there's
it's definitely not a book to be afraid of. It's a book to help enlighten. It's a book to remember some of those things that you did learn. Maybe not all of them, but at one day when you were in your school, you were exposed to some of this stuff.
Some of them, yeah.
And also to connect it to the depth and the profundity. And I mean, I just love the word fundamentals. It's so everything. I'm so glad that your publisher let you use this title.
Yes. It was a bit of a struggle, actually.
I'm not surprised, honestly, because I know a bit about the publishing world, but it's so important. It underlies, it is this book.
Yeah, they were, of course, worried that it would be confused with fundamentalism.
Oh, gosh.
Because I think there is a text of fundamentalism that's called Fundamentals, I believe, or something very close to it. So that's why we have a subtitle. But
10 Keys to Reality. Yes.
I chose this because I did want it to be kind of an antidote to fundamentalism. There, we need to confront that. Really.
I agree. Yeah, it's interesting that getting down to the fundamentals, as you said, it actually is in many ways antithetical to dogma. Because if we really understand the roots, the seeds, then we can reason the flowers and the vines and the trees and everything that grows from them.
Yeah, but and the idea that the fundamentals are the result of hard inquiry and are backed up by mountains of facts that are irrefutable, and people try to knock them down. Actually, they get Nobel Prizes for changing these laws.
This is not dogma in the sense that some smart guy thought of it once and then everybody just believed him.
Not at all. And it's not based on some sacred text that if you examine the facts, turns out to be of dubious provenance. And so it's a very different approach to what's fundamental, and I think a much more fruitful approach, first of all, in terms of producing things that make people happy and that are useful, but also a much more worthy approach. I mean, there's the world out there. This is God's work. Shouldn't we engage that rather than engaging some text and be instructed from the pulpit to ignore that? That's just so backwards. And
Here, I agree with that. And I think a lot of people listening to this show, that's probably how they tend to. I don't think they would have stuck with me for the 360 odd episodes that we've made it so far if that weren't the case. So Frank, I always end my show by asking my guests the exact same two questions, because I have had the opportunity to interview scientists and public communicators of science from all disciplines and all walks of life. And I'm always fascinated to see where they kind of net out with these two questions. So get ready, because they're big picture, but I know that's in your blood.
Okay.
All right. So when
these questions are coming as a surprise to me, I should have done more research.
No, I'm glad you didn't. It's better this way. So when you think about the future, and I want you to kind of run through this in whatever context is relevant to you right now. So this could be very personal. It could be social. It could be global, or even cosmic. Obviously. Whatever layer you want to approach it. When you think about the future, number one, what is the thing that really is keeping you up the most at night? The thing you are concerned about, you are maybe even a little pessimistic or cynical about, the thing that you're worried about. And then on the flip side, to kind of end on a more positive note, where are you authentically, truly optimistic? Where do you really see hope?
Well, I think, okay, so what keeps me up at night? If I
Mm.
gave you the honest answer, it would be very, specific theories that I have out
Mm.
there that are untested about, or that I think are probably right and could be very important, but are the data isn't in. So whether these particles I named and pioneered, axions, really are the dark matter of the universe, I'd like to know that.
Right. It's a pretty unanswered question.
It's an unanswered question, and
Yeah.
we're just getting the technology to answer it. I think in a decisive way. Maybe in the next 10 or 15 years, it should be possible. Maybe sooner, if we're lucky. Um, so that's, and then I'd like to know whether the Enion ideas really do lead to an important technology. And well, I have no doubt that they will, but whether that'll happen on a 10-year time scale or a 100-year time scale, I hope it's 10. I will see.
Right. Selfishly.
And, there are other things that I don't want to go on the laundry list of ideas that I have floating out there that I'm waiting a verdict on, awaiting a verdict of nature. But if I ask what keeps me up at night, I guess it's kind of a race against time in a way. I'm very optimistic about the future of mind in the cosmos, in that I think, as we discussed before, there's been remarkable, in some ways you can quantify exponential growth in the development of mind in recent years, and no end in sight. And I think I like to analogize ourselves to Archaeopteryx. We're the Archaeopteryx of the spirit, and it's hard to imagine what ultimately what the capabilities of birds will be, but that I think it'll be something remarkable and beautiful. And that's what I think. That's what I think and anticipate will happen. But there are failure modes. There are failure modes for sure. There, climate. We could have a dark age brought on by collapse of the climate. We could have a dark age brought on by nuclear war. We could have a dark age brought up by a pandemic worse than the one we've just been experiencing. We could have, so there are many failure modes. An asteroid could hit the Earth. A lot of we can work towards. But none of those is a death sentence at all, and we can do intelligent things to minimize the danger from all those things, and the more powerful minds in the future will be even better at mitigating these. And so there's kind of a race against time, which I think will win. I think mind in the cosmos will win, but it's not a sure thing. So that's kind of the cosmic worry that I have.
Can I, before you tell me about your optimism and your hope, can I just tell you that I'm feeling kind of a very, very profound sense of connection. And I know that this might sound very silly, but when you brought up the words you're saying are resonating with me deeply. And when you brought up Archaeopteryx as this sort of symbol, I have lithographica, the Berlin specimen, tattooed on my arm. We don't know each other. This is not something you would have known about me.
Listeners can't see that, but that's quite dramatic.
I know.
I'm not in my study right now, but in my study, which is just downstairs, I have a sculpture Archaeopteryx, a life-size sculpture, which I see it's on my desk.
It's long been an important symbol for me as well. So wow, it's just incredible that you brought that up.
So
hope. Where are you hopeful?
Well, the hope.
That's the other side of it, right?
Yeah, the hope is, as I said, I think hope is the most straightforward extrapolation of what's happening. Okay, it's easy to get diverted or misled by crises, by having a loudmouth fool as president of the United States, for instance, and But there's global tensions and so forth. But if you take a longer view, if you think about where humanity was 100 years ago, even, you just realize that we've come an awfully long way, and there's so much more wealth, there's so much more health, there's such much more profound understanding of the physical world, and the growth of artificial minds, the enhancement of our own minds with knowledge and also techniques of eating better and using the tools that we're building, mental tools as well. So I think the most straightforward extrapolation is very optimistic. So there are failure modes, but if we manage to avoid the failure modes, I think the future of humanity is open-ended, and humanity might start to look different. It might be more cyborgish, and we might have partnerships with what we would now call machines, or the vanguard of intelligence might even pass over into some quite different embodiment. But if your circle of empathy widens to consider just the future of mind and intelligence in the universe, I think the future looks awesome.
Oh, yes. Widen that circle of empathy, and also that perspective, that view, the long view. Look at our past to understand how far we've come. Frank, I mean, such important insights, such a kind of exhilarating conversation. I really want everybody to head out, check out Fundamentals: 10 Keys to Reality. Frank, thank you so much for joining me. I had a wonderful time today.
It's been a joy, a real joy, especially this revelation of Archaeopteryx. Wow. That's really extraordinary. So thank you.
Thanks so much. And to everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.